Hi, everybody. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This episode is brought to you by Wren, W-R-E-N. Wren. What is Wren? Wren is a startup that's making it easy for everyone to make a meaningful difference in the climate crisis. I mean, most of us feel like, what can I do, right? You can join Wren, and when you do, they plant trees. Their goal is to unlock the collective action of millions of individuals to drive the kind of change needed to end the climate crisis. And they do so by getting you to lower your carbon footprint. They'll actually do the calculation for you. I've done it. It's pretty cool. How much carbon do you use? What is your footprint? Then, based on your lifestyle, of course, everybody varies. And then they'll offset that by planting trees, which ultimately protects the rainforest, it sequesters CO2 gases, and so on. So when you sign up through this show, they will plant 10 extra trees in your name. So here's how you do it. You go to wren.co/Shermer. That's WREN.co/Shermer, S-H-E-R-M-E-R. Check it out, wren.co/Shermer. Just give them your name. It's free to sign up. And then you can upgrade from there for different programs that they have. But right off the bat, 10 trees in your name. I already did that, and that was pretty cool. And, collectively, of course, that makes a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of difference when I get 10 trees planted in my name. But if enough of us do it, it starts to make a difference, right? So this is a collective action problem, as they call it in economics. No one of us can make a difference, but together, if we have enough of us working on it, we can make a difference. So that's what Wren is all about. I'm happy to have them, honored to have them as a supporter, sponsor of our show. And so I hope you do too. WREN.co/Shermer. Check it out. All right. For this episode, Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the teaching company. I talk about them all the time because I'm a huge fan. Long before there was this podcast, long before there were even podcasts, I was listening to the teaching company courses, and then I ended up producing two myself. I'm a fan. I listen to their courses all the time when I'm driving, cycling, hiking, doing chores, whatever. And it's a great way to kind of multitask, and they've switched now to a subscription service, which is fantastic. You just pay an annual subscription fee, and then you get access to all their content online, which is fabulous. You go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get a free trial and a 20% discount off the annual subscription rate. Check it out. Go to wondrium.com, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, and get your free trial. Why would you not want to do this? It's great. It's free, right? You get to check it out, and you can always just opt out later if you want. Here's a course that I finished recently. I think I talked about this in a previous episode, Democracy and Its Alternatives. This seems like a very timely course, and it is 24 30-minute lectures. Is Democracy Built to Last? Politics and Personal Sacrifice, Government and the Invention of Law, The Rise of the Modern State, States, Nations, and Nationalism. That's the subject of our fourth issue for 2022 on Nationalism Matters. Do political parties help or hurt? We have two. We have a duopoly here. How come we don't have six like European countries have, or more? Well, this course explains why. Is the European Union a success or failure when the balance of power breaks down, as we've seen recently? Why it's so hard to work together? Psychology, sociology, social psychology can explain all that. And then the last lecture on gridlock and democracy. Look, you can see I've listened to all these lectures. The little line tells you how far you've gone. Oh, that's the other thing. If you stop listening and you come back to it later, it picks up right where you were. Even if you switch to another course and start there and come back to this one, it remembers it. It's fantastic. Anyway, check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free trial. 20% discount. Well worth it. All right. Here's our episode. Just to remind everybody who is not familiar with the show, it is produced by and run by Skeptic magazine, which I co-founded back in 1992 with my partner, Pat Lindsay, who I always like to give credit to, who died a year ago this summer. After 30 years, we've been publishing, and we have a new design now. This is our latest issue on abortion matters. We got a pro-life and a pro-choice article. And our new issue coming out in a couple of weeks is on race matters, and then nationalism matters for the fourth one. First one for the year was on trans matters. Go to skeptic.com to download those, or if you're old school and like print magazines, we keep them all in print, going all the way back 30 years. So you can get those, or you can go to your local bookstore. Okay, my guest, I was going to mention the artwork behind me is always rotating. This is the original artwork for the cover of my very first book, Why People Believe Weird Things. You can see the kind of the matching artwork there, with a foreword by Stephen J. Gould, who I'm going to bring up in just a moment after I introduce.
Yes.
My guest today is Saleem Ali, who was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but he grew up in Lahore, Pakistan until his college years, receiving his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Tufts University and his master's and PhD degrees in environmental policy and planning at Yale and MIT, respectively. He holds the blue and gold distinguished professorship in geography and spatial sciences, so we'll have to ask him about that, at the University of Delaware, and is honorary professor at the University of Queensland in Australia. Dr. Ali's laurels include being a National Geographic explorer, having traveled for research to over 150 countries. That's cool. Being chosen as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, and serving on the 7-member science panel of the Global Environment Facility, the world's largest multilateral trust fund for the environment held in trusteeship by the World Bank. His earlier books include Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, and he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and Royal Geographical Society in the UK, and also serves on the boards of Adventure Scientists and Mediators Beyond Borders International, along with his wife Maria and sons Shermer and Ali. The family are citizens of Australia, Pakistan, and the United States. He is truly an international man of mystery. Hi, Saleem. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a real honor. I've followed your work, and you are in the acknowledgements of the book because your show goes into great depth on topics which often others cover in a very cursory way, and I often refer to some of your interviews to gain insights. Okay,
Saleem, you gotta lean forward a little bit more to the mic, or speak up a little louder because it's a little quiet.
Yeah, sure. Okay, is that better? Okay,
that's perfect. Okay, I'm going to read one of your opening passages here. Your intro is a little autobiographical, so I want to get into that before we get into the meat of your theory. You write, during my doctoral days at MIT in the late 1990s, I would frequently visit the Peabody Museum at Harvard. The brooding brick building full of enigmatic skeletons and precious mineral archives was my secret happy place in the cold New England winter months. On one such visit to the museum, I had the good fortune of encountering the late doyen of natural history, Stephen J. Gould. This was a man whom the New York Times would later call, in his obituary, the best-known evolutionary biologist since Charles Darwin. I can think of a few biologists who kind of objected to that, but I won't name any names. Gould was all bundled up in a woolen coat and wearing a peculiar cap, ready to exit the building on a brisk Thursday night. He was running to catch a train to South Station and on to New York City, from where he commuted back and forth to Boston. I followed him persistently with a cavalcade of compliments which did not stir his attention. He was known to be prickly and dismissive, yet despite an initial rebuff to my servility, we were able to strike up a conversation on the fabled Red Line T train into the city. During the 20-minute train ride, I learned from Gould that the culminating book he was working on was to consider the structure of evolutionary theory. He reminisced on how his work as a public intellectual had forced him to look for structure and order to convey complex ideas to the general public. In return, this quest for structure had motivated him to reconsider his lifelong study of Darwinian evolution to seek patterns. This magnum opus was to be Gould's last book, a 1,400-page, beautifully illustrated tome published just 2 months before his death. Okay, here it is. I have it right here. Now that is a tome. That is a doorstop of a book. And here he is, the great one, Stephen J. Gould. Yep. So that's great. So tell us, that to a certain extent was kind of an inspiration for you for your work. Finding structure and order in the apparent chaos of nature. That's what Gould tries to do here. That's what you try to do in your book, which I did not give a proper introduction. It's called Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life. So let's start there.
Yes, thank you, Michael. So Stephen J. Gould was indeed quite inspirational and sort of led me towards this book, although it took me 20 years to really get to the point where I could write it in a coherent way. And along the way, of course, I had to go through the usual writing of papers and other things to go through the academic ladder. So, with Gould, what I found really remarkable was how he was able to also make his work very relevant to some of the most pressing conversations of our times. And people often accused him of being contrived because of that. Like for his book, The Mismeasure of Man, he tried to take on some of the ways in which social Darwinism could be misused. And I think, one of the things that became really important for me was like what I call functional order. Sometimes you have to look at different scales of analysis, and what may not be true at one scale is functionally fine at another scale. And for me, that has been sort of the way in which I have charted my own work. I'm an environmental planner by training. My PhD is in environmental planning, and planning is a very practical field. It's essentially applied geography. It's very much about like solving problems for the future. So that's how I've approached this, and I've tried to bring in nuance in the book and make sure that I always look for exceptions and some of the kinds of critiques that have been put forward in terms of Gould's work. Also, I try to address those. But ultimately, I'm trying to see, how can we have a functional society which considers all these different sort of foundational elements of the laws of nature, and how well can they be applied to social and political systems?
Yes, nicely put. A couple comments on Gould and his work there. First, there's kind of an idea going around that his book, The Mismeasure of Man, in which he remeasured Morton's skulls from the 19th century that purported to show racial differences in brain size, was later debunked like in the 2010s or 2000s, I guess. But that was then redone itself by Massimo Pigliucci and his colleagues, showing that, in fact, Gould probably did get it right in his analysis. And so, this is a nice indication of how science works, right? You try to,
exactly.
Test something or replicate it, and you try to replicate it again, and you go back and forth. And I think he's pretty much been vindicated on that point. The second point I was going to make about punctuated equilibrium, which gets to your work, that is in which you're trying to impose some kind of order or structure on nature. People often took punctuated equilibrium to be like another force like natural selection, whereas really the more modest version of it was just a description of what the fossil record would look like if allopetric speciation were the process by which new organisms arise in evolutionary history. So, for example, allopetric speciation is Ernst Mayer's idea that you have a founder population that breaks off from the huge gene pool. Maybe there's a mountain range or a river. They're separated from an island from the mainland. Whatever the geographically isolating mechanism is that breaks off a portion of this small gene pool from the bigger one. And then you can get rapid evolutionary change because the gene pool is not very big for the little founder population. In some cases, like in the Galapagos, it may just be a pregnant female or just one couple of birds or a pregnant tortoise or whatever that gets out there and starts a whole new population. So you can get kind of rapid evolutionary change. So what Gould and Eldredge said was that if you look at the fossil record, you're going to see a long period of stasis where there's not a lot of change, and then all of a sudden a break in the fossil record where it looks like it happens really fast. But it's not happening fast in some, like it happened in a week or something like that. And it's not like a mutant, some genetic freak that all of a sudden arises and you have a new species. That isn't really what it meant at all. But I remember an X-Files episode, you mentioned you liked X-Files, where I think it was Scully who was explaining to Mulder, that's right, that this mutant that they had found was due to punctuated equilibrium. I thought, oh, that's such a crazy way to use that theory because it's not at all what it's about.
Absolutely. You've summed it up so well in terms of the specific example of island biogeography. And, one of the things also that the book attempts to do is bring in some of that kind of natural science conversation within social and political discourse, because we can learn a lot from that in terms of even just heuristically how we think about how different kinds of populations are going to be developed. We're looking at migration flows and so on. And certainly with reference to the way in which islands and order develops in different island societies, whether we get equilibrium or we get some kind of functionality between species. It's also one of the things that I talk about is not just discovering that sense of order, but you can invent that order. In the case of Darwin, a very interesting example which I mentioned in the book is around Ascension Island, which is in the South Atlantic. And I had a chance to be very close by to that in St. Helena Island, where Napoleon was exiled. And a little known fact around what Darwin tried to do in Ascension was he wanted to actually create a viable environment for humans to habitate, basically. And so the limiting factor was there was no water, the fresh water. And so he basically tried to create an ecosystem whereby you could have enough of this sort of evapotranspiration process, and then you could develop a little pond. And it actually happened. And now there are people living there, So, it's great when biology and sociology connect like that.
Yeah, your background, if we could go back to that for just a moment, to what extent do you attribute your, as I said, international flavor of, growing up in different environments and international travel and so on, aided you or kind of nudged you into being interdisciplinary in your studies? I mean, your book ranges from, quantum physics all the way to economics. I mean, that's really quite a range. Do you owe some of that just to your personal history and background?
Yes, I think that the tradition in the East is generally what we call in the Orient, one might say, is one of, trying to find comprehensive rationality. Now, sometimes the Orient has gone astray with that because they go into very sort of superstitious approaches to knowledge gathering. And, growing up in Pakistan, I was tempted into those kinds of domains because I grew up in a very, traditional family in Pakistan. The reason why my mother took me back from Massachusetts to Pakistan was that she wanted me to have more of a traditional upbringing in Pakistan and in Islamic society and culture. And so there was a kind of holistic approach. Often it was a bit misguided, but it did make me think about connections. Like, in Islamic tradition, you have like Islamic economics. There are like huge, treaties written on Islamic economics. And then you have, all this kind of tension around like, how do we reconcile the Quran with science and so on. So I always kind of was made to try and build connections between these fields. Often they were going in errant directions from a genuinely scientific perspective. But that, I think, did guide me ultimately towards trying to be more of a systems thinker. And, now if people ask me, like, how do you define yourself? Yes, I'm the chair of the Department of Geography because geography is a very all-embracing discipline. And, in many universities and tendency for reductionism, they've done away with geography as a field. But the reason why National Geographic is so captivating to the public is because it does bring together everything from, the mummies in Egypt to the Big Bang, So it's so geography is very much in that sense a synthetic arena for system scientists. But if people ask me, what are you? I would say I'm an environmental system scientist because I try to bring together those linkages.
What is spatial science?
Spatial science, yeah.
Your
exactly. So,
what is that?
So, the way geographers often describe themselves as geography is the study of why things happen, where they happen, and how they happen. And it's the where they happen, which is the most significant in terms of the methods geography uses. And that's spatial analysis, basically trying to figure out, geographic information systems, for example, and how now we're using computational techniques to understand that. So when we were kind of thinking about how can we make our department more attractive for kids coming into college, we thought we should focus on that aspect of geography, which is where things happen, because that's what is often most alluring. And so we decided to add spatial sciences within the term because our most popular courses are geographic information systems, and trying to look at now, for example, we're using our GPS positioning systems and Google Earth and all that. I mean, that's where a lot of our graduates are going, is into spatial sciences and using big data analytics. So that's where spatial sciences comes from.
And is it related to big history, as it's sometimes called?
Big history can have some aspects of it. Big history tends to be much more temporally determined, of course, because it's history itself. And certainly in geography, we do bring in the temporal dimension. But we often tend to be very much focused on the geospatial side of things. And increasingly, there is much more, longitudinal analysis and so on as well that's done. And so big history can come into that. I think big history kind of is much more in the tradition of kind of sort of grand visioning, and it's more almost philosophical in some ways. And certainly, your training in that arena comes through. So yes, but I have followed big history conferences every now and then, and they're great. They definitely give you.
I think you discussed, if I recall, Geoffrey West's work on cities and the power law. Like, you can predict how many gas stations there'll be and how many banks and so on in a city, depending on the population size, in a very predictable way. That's a kind of imposing some structure, not imposing, really discovering the structure that is there in the real world.
Yes, Geoffrey West's book Scale is fantastic in terms of looking at the way in which power laws can be used to understand the linkages between different kinds of systems. He does talk about cities in a similar way, like I've also tried to make the connection between natural order and social order particularly. I think where I try to go into more of a kind of applied sustainability lens. He gets to that right in his final chapter, but my approach is much more kind of like the purpose of the book is so that we have that foundational knowledge to move towards sustainability. But yes, I think Geoffrey West's book is very important in trying to understand how complex systems can be applied. Now, in some areas, I feel he doesn't provide like enough information on why exceptions happen. Like, in many cases, he gives this kind of correlation graph. There are many correlation graphs in the book, but there are always these outliers, and he doesn't really explain why the outliers happen. And I've tried to bring in that analysis also. In one of my chapters, I talk about errors and how, it as one of the endorsements in the book, notes by Lucas Joppa, who's the chief environment officer of Microsoft. He says, it's the study of order is a very messy process. Even though you're actually trying to understand order, the reality is there are always going to be these exceptions. You're going to have these kinds of deviations, and understanding those is just as important, because there is the allure of patterns which can sometimes lead us astray also. And that's especially in the case of social systems, where if you study patterns to a certain point, they can lead to prejudice as well, right? Because that's where stereotypes come from. Stereotypes come from thinking about patterns and having too much of a thinking of pattern. And you're in your own work, conspiracy theories come from the same way, where you start to see patterns too much, and then you don't try to see the exceptions and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it's good. It's actually good to do that. The world would just be this buzzing, chaotic place if we weren't able to sift out of the noise some patterns. So patterns are real. It's just the question is signal detection problem, right? Which are the real patterns, which are not? You can make the type 1 error, you think the pattern is real when it's not, or you can make a type 2 error where the pattern is not real and you think it is, right? You also mentioned a type 3 error.
Or a type 3 error.
Which one is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the type 3 error is where you have the right answer, basically, but you're looking at the wrong problem itself.
Oh,
and
right.
so So there you can have a situation where you're using the wrong sample size of the population, and you can end up with that kind of type 3 error.
Yeah. So you mentioned Islamic economics. What is that? I've never heard that term.
This is where when you try to force paradigms and try to also have, normative impulses which are dictating what ends up being in the analysis. So, Islamic economics is basically trying to apply some of the fundamental tenets and beliefs of Islam to developing economic systems. So you try to impose a structure based on certain norms. So in the case of Islam, one of the most fundamental norms is aversion to interest. So how do you develop market systems where you do not have interest? And in the same way, for in terms of credit markets, how do you develop that? And so Islamic economics has developed as a field around that kind of notion of having interest-free banking, and sometimes it becomes a bit of smoke and mirrors, because you still need, if people want to get a mortgage, but they're not borrowing from a bank with interest, but there's an investment fund which is then giving returns in a certain way. So that's basically Islamic economics, and there's plenty of now applied work around that kind of banking system particularly.
Interesting. Is that because the Quran prohibits the charging of interest?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it goes back to a sense that interest leads to exploitation, and of course we see that with credit card debt in the US, that yes, it can lead to exploitation, especially in that regard. But in traditional economic system, usury was also frowned upon, and we do have usury laws, but Islam is a bit even more strict beyond just this conventional notion of usury, that you're actually focusing on any form of interest, because it leads to exploitation by the creditor.
Right, and this also biblical injunctions against that, which led to some forms of anti-Semitism and pogroms against Jews who being cut out of a lot of industries migrated toward being the middleman in financial transactions. And the middleman in a financial transaction can't do it for free, right? They have to pay their own bills. They have to, they got to get paid too. And interest is the way you get paid. And you can't just lend somebody money now in hopes that they pay it back sometime in the future without putting a price on the value of that money in the future had you kept it. And that's what interest rates are, right? I could not live in a house that I own. Well, I don't really own this house. I guess the bank does. I own some of it. The bank owns the rest of it. And if I don't send them that check every month and if I miss a couple months, then, they're going to come and take this house back. But without the interest that I pay on the mortgage, they wouldn't lend me the money. So you have to have that. So here's what I'm getting at. I understand the injunctions because it can lead to abuse, right? Like there used to be debtors' prison, right? Where they would imprison people who were in debt. And then, we passed laws against that and so forth. and yet a modern economy could never operate without interest. It can't. It would never get off the ground. Right, you couldn't have these major corporations like Apple Computers. They would never do that without being able to carry huge loads of debt. And in which case we wouldn't have iPhones and electric cars and whatever you like about the modern world.
Yeah, totally.
So here it seems like a reasonable religious norm or injunction doesn't fit with the modern world. Therefore, something has to go. And then I guess I would ask, is that different? Is that different from, say, Islamic physics? Is there Islamic physics or it's really more in the social realm?
Yeah, there are plenty of Muslim scientists who try to find scriptural examples of how the laws of physics are described in the Quran. So that's kind of where the Islamic physics comes in. But sometimes that's a bit specious because there are plenty of things, if you take literally, that are completely not congruent with the contemporary empirical research. So, but going back to a point about interest rates, and this is something I do cover in the book, is that interest rates and any form of risk delivery needs to be considered in terms of how we develop social order. So, if when you talked about the point about how Facebook and all these companies, they developed because of someone was willing to take a risk, and you had some venture capital people or whoever was able to give them that money. Similarly, you can have social mobility, which comes from people willing to lend someone money to have a house, or so you improve quality of life through that risk. But how we actually measure risk and how we make decisions on risk, that's a fascinating area of research and inquiry. And what impact does risk have in terms of the resilience of systems over the long run? And this is where, the work of the Black Swan author, Nassim Taleb, I mean, his 5-book series is quite amazing in that regard, and he comes up with the notion of anti-fragility, which is that ultimately you want systems which actually become toughened by adversity. And so, even if you are taking a risk in some form and there is a negative outcome, the system actually becomes stronger. And the human body is an example. Our muscles are like that. Like when you were cycling out there, you were exhibiting anti-fragility because you were increasing a certain level of resilience in your body in the long run. So, I mean, that's where we need to start thinking about risk in a much more useful way. So if we are going to charge interest rates, or if we're going to have credit systems, those risk systems should be aligned towards some kind of long-term constructive outcome.
Right. So here the government has laws and regulations that prevent fraud and so forth, but they do get pretty loose around venture capital and investments. They want people to take risks because this is how we end up with the internet and smartphones and electric cars and so on. We want to reward the handful of winners, and the kind of resentment of wealth that you often see of, it's so unfair, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, take your pick. It's so unfair that they have that much money. But in fact, what we're forgetting is for every Jobs, there's, 1,000 guys that started companies in their parents' garage in the 70s, and they went out of business, right? And, my venture capitalist friends tell me, that they fund with significant money about 1 out of every 100 pitches that they hear. Right. So the other 99, they just weren't particularly interesting. Then of, let's say the 100 that they fund, maybe one makes it to a huge payout, an IPO, or they get bought up by Google or Apple or whatever. And the entrepreneurs who started it, make $1 billion overnight. And we only see that. We don't see the 2 other cuts, the 99% and then the 99% who got nothing. They either went out of business or they're just kind of still struggling along, barely making a living. And so in a way, I guess as a society, we're willing to say, okay, we will put up with the Jeff Bezos buying their 50-foot yachts or 150-foot yacht or whatever it is, and his rocket ships and all the crazy stuff that wealthy people do, because we want to have those products and services because the rest of us benefit from it. And we just don't even see the losers.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, this is where also some of the lessons in the book in terms of linking the way in which natural systems function, what we can learn from them with reference to these kinds of social systems. So with reference to, for example, these companies that are not heard of, why is it they're not heard of anymore is because we tend to also have this kind of just like we have a herd mentality in natural systems, we tend to get a herd mentality with reference to the way in which markets function and how investors are going to see certain areas of interest. And then you lose out on a lot of other opportunities because you are following that kind of herd mentality. And this happened, of course, during the dot-com bust, because at that time you had the e-commerce mania and you had all of this massive investment. But if you were to look at it from the point of view structurally, like there is such a thing as a natural monopoly, right? So you will get to a certain level of order around natural monopolies like Amazon or eBay, or because people will just see the convenience of having that one-stop opportunity. And so then the next question to ask is, okay, if you get these kind of natural monopolies where that can happen, then how are you going to govern them so that they are not going to be exploitative? And how are you going to figure out mechanisms for distribution of the wealth that is going to accumulate? And so for example, some of my own research has been in mining and minerals, and my empirical work is on environmental and social impact of mining. And mining is a high risk, high reward industry. So you get people who are going to be able to take very high risks, and they are the ones who go to get the most rewards. Now, why they take the risk is for the high reward. And you do get natural monopolies that can happen with mining because of the way in which it's structured. So my next book actually is going to be on aluminium, because it's a fascinating element, and it's got a really remarkable story in terms of how it's the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, but we didn't actually isolate it in the late 19th century. And now we have the most products of any metal on Earth from it. But it started off as a monopoly situation, because you had, the Alcoa became a natural monopoly and still dominates in many ways. And then it was like, how do you get those people who make all this wealth? So you had like the guy who started Alcoa was Charles Hall. He was an undergrad at Oberlin College when he started, discovered this process along with a French guy independently. And then they, but then, the company was established, and you had people like the CEO of Alcoa was Arthur Vining Davis, which in his time was the Bezos of the time, and we still have the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. Now, how do you when you get that level of wealth, how can you figure out like a way then socially to develop it in a sense that's going to be functional for the rest of society? And there is a role for government there, but it needs to be calibrated so that you don't disincentivize the high risk, high reward approach.
Right. I wrote about that in The Mind of the Market, because I was writing about the Sherman Antitrust Act and its precedent-setting cases that had been decided in courts in the century since it was passed, allowed the government to indict an individual or a company on one or more of four crimes. 1, price gouging, charging more than the competition. 2, cutthroat competition, charging less than the competition. 3, price collusion, charging the same as the competition. And 4, monopoly, having no competition. Well, you can bust somebody for anything then.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just crazy.
Absolutely. There has been an abuse of those kinds of laws for sure. But ultimately, we have to think about then what's the kind of best public-private relationship that's going to give us social order that's most instructive. And you do have people like, some of the economists who Mariano Mazzucato and others who have looked at the role of government in fostering innovation, and what is that sort of sweet spot between public and private engagement. And I believe there is, just like we have the Goldilocks zone in the laws of nature, I think there is that sweet spot between public and private, because it's between the collective good and the individual agency that you can find that. And unfortunately, people just don't want to struggle with finding that sweet spot, so you get polarized politics between the free marketeers and the complete sort of Bernie Sanders brand of, government intervention. And there is a lot of opportunity in the middle, and not just in a trite way. I mean, I'm talking about figuring it out, dealing with the tough data analysis and saying, this is how we do it.
But ultimately, that would be decided politically, right? That, we push for our guy to be in office, or our senators and congressmen who would take control of the House and Senate and so on, and then pass legislation that nudges the system in the direction we think it should go. And then 4 years or 6 years later, the other team does the other thing, and it kind of goes back and forth in a window, something like that. Let me just read. You know more about this than I do, obviously, so we'll have to talk about it when your next book comes out. But here's what I wrote. In 1886, Charles Martin Hall solved the problem of how to commercially produce aluminum by a process of passing an electric current through a bath of cryolite and aluminum oxide that left a semi-rare metal byproduct, aluminum. With financial backing, Hall founded the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, which in 1907 changed its name to the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa. Shortly after Hall introduced his revolutionary new smelting system, he managed to reduce the price of aluminum from $545 a pound to $8 a pound, a 98.5% cut, initially producing 10 pounds a day for a gross take of $80 a day. By the 1930s, the company was generating $1 million a day, but instead of raising the price, as monopolies are alleged to do, following the folk intuitions that rule our economic understanding, Alcoa cut the price of aluminum to a mere 20 cents a pound, 97.5% off the existing price. As a reward for this remarkable contribution to the wealth of the nation and its millions of consumers, the Department of Justice sued Alcoa in 1937, charging the company's directors on 140 criminal counts, including excessive prices. Okay, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. Maybe there was some shenanigans.
No, that's
maybe they
great
were.
That you... Yeah, no, it's great you covered that. And, this is where in the third part of the book on political order, the book has three parts. There's natural order, social, economic order, and political order. I talk about the challenge of democratic systems dealing with these kinds of complex problems, and whether it's the way in which Alcoa was cracked down upon, or generally, as you were referring to, there's this kind of cyclicality in political systems that we tend to find that people, after a while, and there's psychological research on this also, there's kind of this grass is greener on the other side, and then people get tired of the incumbents. And I mean, the data is quite stark, in the midterm elections and what happens each time. And so then you have to think about, like, for societal good, is that the best outcome in terms of long-term planning for sustainability? And it's a really tough question. And this is where the notion of technocracy comes in, like what should be the role of science in a democratic society? And how can we calibrate that sort of individual agency versus the importance of actually more science-based decision-making? And we had, Kenneth Harrow told us about this with the voters paradox. Amartya Sen, great Nobel laureate as well, he came up with this. He called it the impossibility of a Paretian liberal. Basically, he said that you can never have, if you want a liberal society, you can never have Pareto optimality, right? Which is a bit troubling, because for those of us, we want efficiency and so on. But where do we get that? So, but the counter argument to that, and that's what people like critics of China, for example, would say, is that there is a self-correction mechanism in democratic societies, which you do not have in autocratic societies. And so even though from a technocratic point of view, it's much less efficient to be in a democracy, if you get things wrong, you can correct them, whereas in a place like China, you can't necessarily correct them. But that has been tested now, and actually it's not always true, because they are able to correct in many cases. So then it becomes a normative issue. It's like much more about individual agency and rights are important, even, and inefficiency is a price we are willing to pay for that.
Yeah.
Right.
let me just note parenthetically here, since I pound on Trump all the time on this show and on social media, that before he lost his mind over the 2020 election, he was doing pretty much what Republicans always do. Lower taxes, deregulate business, give a big boost to the economy, the stock market just goes crazy, and so on. And people are outraged by this, but that's what all Republicans do. That's why they are there. That's their job, right? And so, there was nothing really particularly surprising about that. You mentioned a couple of things I think maybe our listeners won't be familiar with, and I can't even remember what Kenneth Harrow's voters paradox is. So let's hit that, and Pareto optimality. So hit those two. What's the voters paradox?
So, with voters paradox basically is that you, in a voting system, you're trying to get the best outcome out of the individual voting but you will get an outcome which will probably please nobody. So that's the paradox essentially in a democratic society. And so he sort of mathematically presented that as well. And Kenneth Arrow, for your listeners, a Nobel laureate in economics. And then Pareto optimality. If you go to sort of economics 101, you have this notion, and this goes, the naming is after the Italian economist Pareto, around what is the best kind of most efficient outcome. So usually we use the example of guns and butter. So if you have limited resources in a society and you draw a little graph about how much with those limited sources can you buy either guns or butter. So you can either put all your money into guns or you can put it all into butter. And then there's a production possibility frontier in terms of what can be the best optimal outcome of sharing the resource in terms of how much you put towards one versus the other. But inside that graph, there are lots of decisions you could make which are inefficient, and you are not getting the best investment and you're wasting resources somewhere. So Pareto optimality is like where you are using your resources most effectively, and it's up to you how much you choose between the various different commodities that you want to invest in that regard. So that's the notion of Pareto optimality. So basically what Sen is saying, that in a liberal society, because of the way in which preferences get aligned through individual choice and how people make decisions, you will never get Pareto optimality. And he sort of showed it mathematically that it's not going to happen beyond like a population size of 2. So.
Mm. Is that because of human irrationality, or we're not rational voters, we're not economic rational, utility maximizers, that sort of thing?
That's right. Yeah, to a large degree, it is because of that. And if we get to the point where people are becoming much more into sort of rational decision making and so on, we may potentially. But even then, the rational decision making is going to be based on still some level of individual preference, and individual preference for human beings is inherently it's subjective. Whether you like something, it's more about choice than even rationality about like what do you like. Someone likes Chinese food and someone likes Indian food, and that kind of thing. So. And then the more choice you get in terms of the different offerings. Yeah.
Back to the future discounting, it would be good if I saved up money for my future retirement. That's hard to do, but, I can do that with some discipline. But on the other hand, I don't want to save up for the greatest 90th birthday party anyone ever had and keel over dead at 89. And I can't take it with me, right? So, I want to spend some of it now, but how much should I spend now? What's the optimum? Maybe there is not a correct answer, but maybe there's a window. It's sort of like I was reading about all the military bases the United States has around the world. People complaining, well, these countries must hate it that we have these bases there. No, actually, they like it because we spend a lot of money in those the towns and cities surrounding the military bases. It's good for their economy. It's good if you're a NATO country to have American boots on the ground over there, plus our war material and so forth, with somebody like Putin rattling his saber and so on. So when you say, well, wouldn't it be more efficient if we provided every public school child with a laptop computer and quit spending the money instead on military bases? But that's not the kind of calculation you as a scientist could make, right? That's a political decision. Well, we want national defense and we want education, but you can't have both 100%.
Yeah, but you see, the problem is that you do not have a sort of in complex systems, you have feedback loops on what is working and what is not working in some form, right? So the problem with the security investments is often those feedback loops get cut. You do not get so. We do not have very good accountability in terms of our military investment. And that's why President Eisenhower, in his famous, last address, he warned, even though he was a military general himself, he famously warned us of the military-industrial complex, because it can take on this kind of self-perpetuating and self-prophesizing, outcome where you basically create a mechanism just of the military trying to sustain itself. And then the other question is like, what are the other alternate paths which could be followed for development? So these countries which have, for example, I visited the small island country called Nauru. It's very difficult to visit because they don't usually give you a visa. It's only got 10,000 people, small country, but very resilient people. I mean, they survived so many different invasions and so on. And the economy of that country right now is largely dependent on the Australians having an asylum center where the Australians didn't want to have these refugees coming on their mainland. And so they basically set up this center there, like, okay, if you're an asylum seeker and you come by boat, we're not going to resettle you here, we're sending you there. Now, their economy has become so dependent on this that, they, for a long time, they were just not thinking outside the box. It's like, okay, we've got the money coming in. And they've started to, because the Australians are planning to shut things down, they're thinking of what can be alternative trajectories for their economy and so on. And so that's the other thing. You have to think about sort of multiple futures of what could be possible, especially when you have so much opportunity in terms of these development paths and creating different kinds of order in that way. And this goes back to the sense of emergence also, like you can have emergence in many different avenues. And I know you had one of your previous guests who was talking about convergence, the gentleman who wrote, I think, The Romance of Reality, and saying that ultimately for life there would be that. But that's not true when you're talking about social and political systems in the long run. There's so many different trajectories where you can get.
Yeah, so when you make that transition from talking about physical systems, chemical systems, biological systems, social, economic, political systems, are they different in terms of what we accept as like being true, like quantum physics? I don't understand it. It's pretty weird, but it's true. So that's just the way it goes, right? Chemical bonds are very predictable. This is how it's going to operate. Laws of nature are really just descriptions of stuff that's happening, right? As soon as a star gets to a certain size, and then it reaches a certain temperature, and then at a given temperature, hydrogen fuses into helium, and you get this release of nuclear energy, and now it's a star, and so on. That's just kind of following the laws of nature, right? There's not a lot of degrees of freedom there for a star to choose, right? But as you scale up, how do those degrees of freedom and choice, widen to the extent where you get to politics and economics? And is there no real truth to be found in there? Like, what's the right number for taxation? What's the right number for immigration? Or what are the rules? Like Australia says, well, you have to, if you're coming to live here, you have to have a trade or some kind of job. How are you going to help our country? That's what we want to know. Now, you say that in America, people lose their minds. Like, that's not right. That's not what we stand. So you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, I mean, in the natural systems, and going back to quantum order and so on, I mean, there are some notions of, certainly there's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You have, Gödel's impossibility theorem. And there are certain areas where you even get those sense of like, okay, there is really this unpredictability in certain sense. But you're absolutely right that, we need to know the limits of where that the translational process is plausible and where it is not, because when you increase the scale of the system, you are introducing so many other variables that you cannot have the same kind of neatness to the analysis. And that's something which I try to do very carefully in the book, is that I try to make clear that we need to know the difference between metaphor in terms of this translation and actual translation of those kinds of knowledge systems. And it's very tempting to take a metaphor and run with it, and we see that happening time and again. And that goes back to some of the concerns I was saying about, in some of scriptural analysis, people do that and they take the metaphor and run with it. But when I'm thinking about like, social systems overall, and considering the ways in which we can learn lessons from natural order. One of the things I'm interested in is sort of planetary processes and understanding. So part of the book looks at sort of like, planetary boundaries literature, and looking at ways in which, and that for me, that's the most important. I mean, I'm not as concerned about, these kinds of long-term, what's going to happen to the future of the universe, and in the very, very long term. I'm much more focused on the current sustainability. Yeah, exactly. So in that regard, there are some ways in which we have been thinking about, planetary boundaries, the work of Will Stephan and Johann Rockström, in terms of looking at like 8 or 9 categories of planetary boundaries in terms of the acidification of the ocean or certain other processes. And this ties in also with, like the work of James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, though I critique that in the book, because the Gaia hypothesis also took the metaphor and, people ran with it because they made like, okay, the Earth is a superorganism. No, I don't think Lovelock even thought it was a superorganism. He was basically talking about processes like synchronicity, that kind of process of what can happen in those systems. And then on the other hand, there is this notion of in a functional human society, we also have certain social foundations. And so those social foundations are, the level of well-being which we would want. So you have the planetary boundaries with the natural system and the social foundations. And there's a very famous diagram, which is now used a lot by environmental science researchers, that looks at both the planetary boundary and the social foundation. And it came about through the work of Kate Raworth, who was a researcher at Oxfam in an NGO, but then, it really took on, and now she teaches at Oxford University as well. And she came up with what she called donut economics, which is that you've got the outside of the planetary boundary and you have the social foundation, and there's the safe operating space for humanity within the donut. And so what I try to do is then unpack that at a foundational level, trying to understand what those sort of the laws of nature are, which provide us with that. So I think that's more helpful for people like policymakers and all as they move forward.
Yeah, I just had to record a podcast with Marian Tupy and Gail Pooley from the Cato Institute. Their book is called Superabundance. So they argue that there's an additional element here, which is human creativity and action that other animals don't. So the Malthusian model works on petri dishes and rabbits and whatever your organism is that are under Malthusian pressures. Populations increase geometrically, food supplies increase arithmetically. At some point, you hit a collapse and the system, just collapses. You hit a tipping point. You talk about tipping points in your book. So, but their point is that humans don't do that. We actually respond. We solve problems. Like, we have way more people. We got to figure out a way to increase food supplies, also geometrically, right? So you end up with the Green Revolution and Norman Borlaug and all that happened when Paul Ehrlich was predicting the demise of humanity in the late 60s, early 70s. By the 80s, it would be all over. And that didn't happen, right? And it didn't happen not because we found some new resources, right? Or found a new planet to exploit or anything like that. We created solutions to problems. And, as they said, we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We just found better ways to process food and products and services and so on, and they actually make a counterintuitive point that we will never run out of fossil fuels because of supply and demand. At some point, the last barrel of oil in the ground is going to be $1 trillion, so no one's going to bother, right? We'll just find some other source of energy, electric cars rather than internal combustion engines, and nuclear power to generate the electricity for the electric car, or whatever the solution will be. So there, I think, when you talk about emergent systems and making these metaphors between physical systems, biological systems, and human systems, the human systems have an additional element, humans that are creative at solving problems.
Yeah, I think there is this exceptionalism with reference to human intelligence, but at the same time, we are seeing increasingly that there are also constraints from the laws of nature which apply on that. Even like with computational systems, we know that now there are limits to computing processing power. And with humans, I mean, we are seeing actually a plateauing of innovation. I mean, if you even look at the iPhone, the next model, they put the three cameras, then they're doing like, after a certain point, like what else are they going to do, right? And the touch screen technology was a phenomenal innovation. Actually, part of it was invented here at the University of Delaware, and we have a plaque in terms of the company Fingerworks that started here and then
Oh,
eventually
really?
got sold to Apple. Yeah, but then I mean now that has in some ways like that's the ultimate because we've got fingers and we've got the screen and like they're finding limits to what can happen there. So I'm totally with I consider myself very much an optimist, and I really do believe that optimism ultimately triumphs over pessimism because all the pessimists can have is the satisfaction of being right occasionally, and the optimists, I think, actually have much more going for them. And so, but at the same time, I do worry about some of the complacence which can come from the extreme techno optimism, where with any of these, if you go back to Ehrlich, his famous equation, which he used to give him credit where it's due. I mean, some of his work was really off the wall, but some of it he did, like he lost his bet famously to Julian Simon about copper reserves being depleted, and they clearly were not. But he came. The simple heuristic equation he had was impact equals population times affluence times technology. It's called the IPAT equation, right? It's a heuristic equation. You can't really calculate it, but the technology variable he did put in there. Now that technology can have both sides. The technology can solve the problem, but the technology also can create more problems. So for decision making in large systems, and now we do have multiple criteria decision analysis. Civil engineering has developed all those tools, and one of the people who's given the endorsement on the book was one of my mentors when I was at Yale, Jared Cohen, who later became the president of Carnegie Mellon. And Jared Cohen worked on these kinds of multiple objective criteria decision models, and a lot of that. So we do have people who try to figure out like what's the best optimal way in which we can use technology to come up with these solutions, and there can be some wiggle room in there. So I think your colleagues from Cato at one level have it right that we should consider humanity differently from the petri dish bacteria, definitely, but at the same time we also need to consider that the amount of negative feedbacks that can happen are also areas where other organisms might not have had to deal with those. So, and we have had, and now that doesn't mean human beings are going to become extinct just for that reason. And that's where I disagree completely with the sensationalist environmentalists. We may have alternative futures which are not necessarily the ones we want, but we'll figure it out. But do we really want those? I mean, do we want a Blade Runner world? If you go to science fiction, I don't know. People survived there, and they're doing their thing. But if we can avoid that, why not? So I mean, that's the danger we have with the complete techno optimism, because you then don't see the quality of life.
We want a Star Trek future where everyone has a replicator in their house, and you just walk over and go Earl Grey hot, and not only does the tea come out hot, you get the glass too.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm a great fan of Gene Roddenberry. So.
Yeah. I know you're a Star Trek fan.
Yeah.
Well, of course, some of the techno-optimists, I have to say, they are pretty far out there, right? They're concerned, a little bit too concerned about the far future, and let's not forget that we have serious problems right now. There are some non-trivial percentage of the world's population, even U.S. population, living below the poverty line. If prosperity is so great and so many people have it, and it used to be, 90% of the population lived under the poverty line 150 years ago. Now it's 10%. But 10% is still a lot, especially if they're in a country like the United States. So let's not forget solving those problems. Okay, let's talk about sustainability for a minute, or for more than a minute, because to me this is a really hard problem to solve. So this is what you study. So here's the problem. as I understand it. Like, for example, we're about to hit 8 billion people. Could you feed 8 billion people without factory farming? And if you look at the hidden videos of factory farming, it's just awful. It's just terrible.
Mm-hmm.
We just morally, ethically, we really should get rid of factory farming. But, we got 8 billion people. So, you can't feed them all on happy farms where the little chicken runs around free as a bird and then until it's time, to turn them into food, and the happy cow and so on, right? As I understand it, we're not even remotely close to being able to feed that many people. So I guess the question you have to solve is, when you say how many people can the earth hold sustainably, at what level of quality of life or what standard of living, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, in terms of how we measure well-being, and I have in one part of the book, I talk about the correlation between there is a happiness index that the United Nations has. And then I look at environmental performance, and you do see that there's a correlation between environmental performance and happiness globally in societies. And usually they measure it at the country level, which is always tricky because countries are large places. But sometimes it makes sense because you're looking at policies and how the policies are at the national level. So I would say that with reference to global inequality, we have a huge challenge in terms of developing systems of order which can deal with global inequality. And that's why those of us who are living in the developed world, so to speak, with it's a strange kind of dynamic we have. We have half of the world which is overnourished and has to go to gyms with multi-billion-dollar industries to get rid of calories, and half of the world is undernourished. And if you really look at it, it's a simple distributional problem. And, people like Jeff Sachs have agonized over it. Like, why can't we can create systems of order which can actually deal with it? And if we actually think about it in a natural system, there would be some kind of diffusion, where there would be some process. But we have prevented that system of diffusion, of how that could happen. For example, whether it's with migration, if countries like Italy clearly need human capital because their population is going down, but they don't want immigrants. And so from those places where there's excess population. So you have prevented systems of functionality in a natural process where you would have sort of a gravitational flow from actually taking shape because of prejudice or other factors. So that's why it's become increasingly important for us to think about ways of effective distribution of resources. And I talk about resource distribution both from the point of view of material resources, because I work a lot with minerals and so on, and I have a section there on resource nationalism, for example, but also in terms of resources at the individual level and how we can think about one of the things that there's another book that has recently come out on effective altruism. This Oxford professor is talking about like how individuals can make a difference and create that system. And that's why in my case, in this book, I'm donating all the royalties for environmental education programs, because even though I'm by no means some tycoon academic, I feel as though I'm in a very privileged position. I've got an endowed professorship. I've got, a very comfortable life, a lot of flexibility. And if this can actually make a difference in some form, whether I'm donating books for environmental education in Pakistan or somewhere, that's going to be rewarding. And what we see is clearly now the problem with that is, of course, how you develop effective mechanisms of distribution. And there's been a lot of critique about how philanthropy has gone astray, for example, because philanthropy doesn't necessarily follow that kind of sense of, diffusional order of resources where they're most needed. It often follows idiosyncrasies of the philanthropist, which can be very strange. You could have the Sacklers giving 100 million for paintings, and you have someone who's willing to pay 400 million for a Da Vinci painting, which may not even be a Da Vinci painting. So you do have these kinds of bizarre human idiosyncrasies which prevent philanthropy from being effective. And so that's the other key aspect of what we need to develop as a society. I think much more effort needs to go into the resource distribution without stigmatizing it, I wish our friends on the conservative side of the political spectrum, many of times I agree with them, would not stigmatize redistribution, because it's something that it's a strong tradition in American, history, especially in American history, whether it's the Rockefellers or others, in terms of how they manage their wealth. And then some would say they did it very effectively.
Here, I'll give you the standard conservative talking line on that. They do believe in redistribution, but it should be private, right? So Rockefeller, Carnegie, they volunteered to give their money that they earned through the capitalist system. In the case of Carnegie, building libraries, and Rockefeller his foundation to support many organizations and so on. And that by having the government do it rather than you privately or through your foundation or through church or religious charity or whatever, you're taking the moral element out of it. So I give to you something because I want to support your environmental efforts, and I feel good about myself doing that. The money goes directly to your foundation. There's no middleman that takes a cut. But if the government decides they're going to support your environmental program and they tax me now, first of all, I'm not volunteering to give you the money. I just have to give it or else. And then they take it, they take a cut because they got to pay their employees, and then they give you some percentage of what's left. So this is the conservative talking point that, you've taken.
And I agree with that to some degree. I like that guy, there's this Dutch historian who became a best-selling author about, some of his idea was that just tax everyone, and he got Tucker Carlson invited him, and then he just threw him out of the show because he thought he was really being obnoxious about it and this, that. But basically, there are people, I don't think that we should go the absolutist route on taxation as the solution, but I think we need some professional management of resource allocation. So if you go back to the Rockefellers, and, actually I should mention this book was supported partly by the Rockefeller Foundation's Writers Fellowship in Bellagio, where I was able to spend time with some wonderful writers. I mean, Rockefeller professionalized his philanthropy soon after. And even so did Henry Ford, even though Henry Ford was a very weird character in terms of his individual behavior, where, he set up this city in the middle of the rainforest, Fordlandia and other things. But when it came to the Ford Foundation, he actually professionalized it. And then his children also, same is true of the MacArthurs. And I mean, if you professionalize philanthropy through these foundations, you usually end up getting much better outcomes. The problem we have with the new money is that it is not professionalized, and it is extremely idiosyncratic in terms of how the money is being allocated. And like in India, you had one guy, the founder of a mining company, Vedanta, Agarwal, he gave $1 billion to establish a university on Vedic philosophy and Vedanta University. Because that was his thing, now, and they can't even always say that this is because, it's our money, we earned it. Well, it was because of the privatization of state enterprises in India where he was able to suddenly make a fortune. So it's not like a lot of it is luck, a lot of it is, and, one of the things I say to my friends on the right of the political spectrum, I'm very much an independent politically and middle of the road guy. I try to be in terms of letting science dictate my decision making. But I say to them, look, capitalism, one of the fundamental rules of capitalism is people respond to incentives, right? That's the golden rule of capitalism. And it's very much aligned with the laws of nature, right? But we have created a corrupted system where people they're not going to, if you are getting a severance package of $200 million as a corporate executive, which is not uncommon if you look at all the different benefits they get, what incentive do you have to perform? I mean, you tell me you are going to be given a firing pay, which is more than most people will earn in their lifetimes, and you think that is capitalism. I mean, so that's the thing which I find bizarre, is that they are actually not even following many times their own sort of ground rules of capitalism.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read John Mackey's book, Conscious Capitalism. John is the CEO of Whole Foods, and he sold it to Jeff Bezos, and he's still the CEO, or I think he's about to step down. Anyway, he was on the show here. He's just a super interesting, super smart guy. But his argument was that you got to cap the CEO salary at a certain number, a multiple of the average worker's salary, which was in his case 19 times. 19 times sounds like a lot until you look at what Fortune 500 CEOs get, which is like hundreds of times more than the average workers. It does seem outrageous. Although I met a guy high up in Intel who explained to me, I was complaining about this sort of, and just throwing those numbers out. And he said, look, for a company like Intel that makes so much money, if we don't pay this guy $100 million a year with that package or whatever, somebody else will. That's just the market. That's what it costs to get a CEO at that level. And we make so much money, it doesn't matter if we gave him 50 million, 100 million, we wouldn't even notice it in our books, right? So it's like, oh, wow, okay.
But why don't you increase the salary of the lower echelon people? That's the thing where they don't even advert to them. Like I do training for a mining company, I won't mention which one. And I said to them, so they were doing this training in Johannesburg, and I said, okay, we took them on a field visit. We went to, some of these people had never been to a township in South Africa. They've lived their whole lives in Johannesburg. They'd never been to those areas. So I took them there, part of this. And then they were like, okay, so what should we be doing in terms of social? And so their corporate office, they have free food at the corporate office. It's like typical, with a lot of these companies, they say, oh, that's to keep the people happy and all that. I said, why don't you give free food to the miners? They were the guy was complaining that we have food truck problem outside the mine. It's like, for heaven's sake, why can't you give those people free food? You're giving free food to these people who are making 200,000 a year, but it just doesn't advert to them. It's that I find it really confounding. And these are like simple things. It's not even some bleeding heart liberal thing, It's like just following common sense many times.
No, and, that's John Mackey's thing. He's a libertarian. He's kind of a big Ayn Rand fan, but he thinks that that was kind of a wrong turn to make for capitalism. That to forget that all of the stakeholders in the company is not just the board of directors and the CEO, all the employees and the environment, the local neighborhood in which the store is located. That they are also stakeholders, right? In the local river, the air, you should invest in all of that. And that's good for business. You'll make more money in the long run by, kind of dispersing the things you care about other than the quarterly report. And that's your point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and then the other area, which is interesting is, and this goes back to sort of complex systems and how we think about it, is when we do independent public offerings. And I'm thinking like in the long term, I might write about this, and maybe collaborate with an economist around it. Maybe some of your listeners may want to reach out to me about it. The IPO process is the main reason these people become hyper wealthy, right? A large percentage of them is either inherited wealth or it's because of the IPOs. Now, why do they, the process by which the IPO generates that much money because of these people holding shares? It bedevils me. Yes, to some degree you can have those inside, but we have just created a structure where there is entitlement that people who are going to work in these startups are going to get this. So that has created this huge, monstrous situation where when like Facebook had the IPO, and you had these people who gave up their American citizenship because they didn't want to pay taxes and move to Singapore because they suddenly became billionaires overnight. Did they really deserve it? I mean, give me a break.
So yeah, let's use that as an example in your comparative method. Are there other countries that are able to encourage entrepreneurship and creativity and so forth, and yet not have that problem? I don't know, some of these Northern European countries maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can have I think there is some importance which needs to be given to some, what we may call some level of acceptable inequality, because that's based on what people either are willing to invest or what time they have. So I am all for understanding. I don't think we can have a completely flat society by any means, but it's the differential which is the problem. And I think you can create incentives for people to do very well. And I don't think if you were to give me $1 million as $100 million, I think I would still work just as well for the 1 million versus the 100 million, to be honest. You've just created a system of entitlement that people say you need to get the 100 million. And so, and there's been research in Europe around, not just Europe, even Japan. I mean, people don't like to compare Europe because it immediately gets branded as socialist, but Japan, I mean, other parts of East Asia where you have a much less differential, but people are performing very well. You have quality of life indicators which are very high. You have life expectancy which is very high, and this also goes to also subjective sense of well-being. The Japanese CEO does not necessarily want to have a yacht and a mansion in 5 countries and all that, and they're still, the quality of life is pretty good. So I mean, that's part of also in terms of setting, and that's a larger question around how we, it's a more anthropological question around how we think about culture and society, and how we have created expectations, particularly in the US, around some of these areas.
Okay, in terms of sustainability, we're about to hit 8 billion. We'll probably hit 9 or 10 billion by the middle of the century. Maybe by 2100,
Yes.
It'll be back down about where we are now, 8 billion. And hopefully no one will be impoverished. No one will be living below the UN's definition of poverty, which is $2.90 a day, whatever the equivalent that would be in 2100. Something like that. How do you see the sustainability going on indefinitely? Through renewable energy sources, and is nuclear in your equation for those renewable energy sources? Where do you get enough food?
Mm-hmm.
Can you do it without the factory farms? Just kind of walk us through what your model looks like.
I mean, in the book, I go through many different, and I tend to be a little bit skeptical of this kind of sense that we will definitely stabilize at a certain population, because the big wild card is aging research, and also, and there is a section in the book around aging and how we think about demographic order with reference to aging research. And MIT famously had that competition in technology review where they tried to give a prize for anyone who could say that we cannot reverse aging, and no one won the prize. There was one team which won a partial prize, but because there are scientific processes and opportunities whereby we could do that. So that being said, that's a caveat around this. But if we think about the overall demand needs, if we want a certain level of quality of life. So for example, we still have about 900 million people who don't have access to grid electricity in the world. Now, people would say that access to electricity is a fundamental human right now, because at some level now our quality of life is defined by it. Yeah. Similarly, we've got also with now increasingly with the internet and communication rights about like what kind of communication infrastructure do we need. And COVID made this very apparent around what kind of infrastructure is needed to have resilience in a society where you could have a pandemic. So where do we get that wherewithal to provide internet to all of the population? I think for that, if we no one has really done a massive energy planning exercise, but if you just look at the thermodynamics, again, going back to sort of the laws of nature, we have to go back to notions of energy density. And, this is where work of Václav Smil is very effective, and he's done a great job in communicating that to the public. And certainly nuclear power is the most energy dense resource that we have for supplying electricity particularly, and it is part of it must be part of the conversation, and in fact we just saw last month that Europe had to change their law. Basically the European Parliament had to reclassify European taxonomy, they call it, that the nuclear power was reclassified as clean energy, because if you look at the basic fundamentals of energy delivery, it's you need baseload power, and we are limited with baseload power. Either you're going to use fossil fuels, or you have nuclear, or you need storage of electricity in batteries or pumped hydro or some other mechanism for storage. And without that, Europe was going to have a tough winter, so they had to reclassify because of the Russian gas embargoes. So, there is definitely an important, and Richard Smalley, the Nobel laureate, he was asked at one point to do a hierarchy of the world's problem solving, and he put energy right at the top, and he said energy, if we can solve energy, then all the other things are cascading down. So I think that's absolutely essential. We need to think about a long-term energy plan for how are we going to provide this delivery with 8 billion people, whatever this population is, and how we're going to be adaptive as a result. Now, we also have opportunities for energy efficiency, which is where I agree with our environmentalist friends. They're absolutely correct that we have lost so much opportunity for energy efficiency, whether it's transmission losses or the way in which we've installed infrastructure, our building infrastructure. We have opportunities in a shared economy and efficiency. I mean, one of the things, I serve on the UN's International Resource Panel, and one of the most fascinating aspects we found, one of my colleagues who's on the panel, who was at the Norwegian University of Technology, he was looking at in COVID, like what was the single biggest thing that reduced our carbon footprint during COVID? And what it was, kids returning and living with their parents and having less distributed housing of people living away from each other, And it was quite remarkable that was one of the most significant areas in certain areas. It wasn't in every community, but in many communities, that was the single biggest way. And now that's a social issue, right? Like how we encourage kids to move out of the house after a certain stage, but we're creating efficiency in terms of energy delivery by having more people living together. And, my son, he was doing his PhD at NYU. He came back after COVID. It's been for 2 years. He's been living back in Delaware. He just takes the train back and forth if he needs to go to New York. And it saved him rent, but it saved a lot of carbon, because of, all of the heating and so on. So, this is where we do need to think outside the box. There is the energy efficiency, but we will need to probably think about energy delivery. For all those people in developing countries, that's not going to solve the problem. We need to provide energy infrastructure for them. Nuclear will need to probably be part of the solution, but we also have, I think, many opportunities for hydropower in different areas, different kinds of. We have geothermal, we have energy differentials, which can be utilized, in kinetics of people like walking on sidewalks and other things. People are finding ways in which you can harness energy and have receptors to do it. But so all across the board.
Right. It's like that book, The Case for Fossil Fuels. You can't exactly be, as a developed nation, tell developing nations who are just making the transition from burning wood and cow pies to fossil fuels, well, you shouldn't do that. It's bad for the environment. Well, thanks a lot. But we want to be a developed nation, right? We want that energy. And, unless you're going to come here and build nuclear power plants for us or plant, seas of solar panels or whatever, come on, they want that too,
and you can't do that. And fossil fuels are very very efficient in delivery. We have to recognize that from a thermodynamic perspective. And again, that's connecting the laws of nature to this. Reason why fossil fuels are so prevalent is especially for transport and mobile fuels. They're very efficient because they're able to generate that energy. We are not able to do that as effectively with that infrastructure. Now, we could find hydrogen, other sources maybe which could compete, but even now that's not true because hydrogen production is very inefficient. So, even especially green hydrogen production, which is what we want to get at. So we have to think in those terms at the full life cycle of the impacts. And that's where there are fields like industrial ecology, which have developed that are really promising because they make people think in systems around life cycle analysis.
You mentioned resource nationalism. I've never heard that phrase. What is it?
Yeah, that's the situation where, if you have certain mineral resources, because part of the challenge of looking at earthly order, as the book suggests, is that resources themselves, geological resources, are not evenly distributed. So the fact that Guinea, like a country I just visited 2 weeks ago in West Africa, it has among the world's largest bauxite reserves for aluminium. It's a accident of geography that it does. And so now, you've got this sense of, okay, we have the resources and we are going to keep them and this is our resource. And there's this sort of resource nationalism which comes around it. So that can also happen at the subnational level. One of the reasons why, for example, South Sudan, one of the factors for it becoming independent was that they did have a lot of oil, and they said, why should we be giving our oil to the full Sudanese state, and we're ethnically different? And so they had their resource nationalism around oil, and they created a new country eventually, right? So you will see this time and again, there are a lot of these movements for creating new political order based on natural resource endowments. Alaska is another one. There have been calls for people saying Alaska should become independent because they've got all this oil, and why shouldn't we go on our own? Texas has said that. Texas has had resource nationalism for the same reason. So that's kind of what resource nationalism is, where you use natural resource endowments to develop a sense of political order, which can sometimes be exclusionary. Now, what we need is good trade eventually for efficient usage of resources, so that you want to get the minerals where it's least energy and cost effective to extract them, rather than saying we're going to find our own minerals completely, and it may be very inefficient to get them. This is one concern I have currently with the new Inflation Reduction Act, which is a good effort overall. I'm supportive of it, but it's focused so much also on we're going to develop our own US national resource base. Well, first ask yourself the question, is it economically and ecologically efficient to do it in the US? Because the natural resource endowments are not following America's borders. If South Africa has most of the world's platinum, America will not have most of the world's platinum. And if you need catalytic converters, you better rely on South African platinum and hopefully recycle it eventually. But that's the way it is. So I think that has to be, and unfortunately we get this kind of, chest beating around, well, we can do it on our own. And that's not helpful within the laws of nature overall.
But those arguments would be made if there were political problems with the country that has the stuff we want, right? So China has all these rare earth metals that we need for our iPhones and whatnot. And so we want to be on good trading ground with them. Germany famously, cut back on its nuclear power just as, Russia was deciding they're going to invade Ukraine and so on. Whoops, maybe we shouldn't rely on Russia for our natural gas because look what's happened. So I can see the argument for resource nationalism that way, but ultimately you'd want to it'd be cheaper to just trade for it rather than having to develop your whole new infant industries and fund it through the government.
And that's why we need, the last chapter of the book talks about, Earth systems governance. And what we need to do, I don't think we can have Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek vision of a global government in the foreseeable future without any countries. But what we could have, and we do have international treaties, what we could have is Earth systems governance around certain key things. There could be mechanisms whereby we say, look, energy delivery, resources for energy delivery, those are something that we all agree to, that they should be harnessed at the level of what is most efficient for the planet, because we don't want to create a situation where we're getting resources in a way that's going to be both damaging and also not economically efficient. We could have treaties around that. We do have, keep in mind, we have the World Trade Organization, and even on the rare earth issue, which you mentioned, in 2012, the United States, Japan, and the European Union took China to the WTO's arbitration mechanism. They said China is fixing rare earth prices and we are going to dispute this. They disputed it and they won, and China made changes. So we do actually have, with the WTO, we actually have a mechanism. We could do the same around mineral exploration, mineral production, energy delivery. And I think those are areas where there can be opportunities for science diplomacy. One of the other areas of work that I do is on what they call environmental peace building, how to use environmental issues for resolving conflicts. And a lot of that comes from my own personal background to some degree, growing up in Pakistan constantly under the shadow of, nuclear war with India, where I always felt like, why can't we have environmental issues at least getting both countries to cooperate with each other? And so I think there is a very practical, and this is not pie in the sky. There are organizations like IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which could develop a protocol around energy delivery. I think like right now the US-China tension is very problematic because the amount of head start China has in terms of both its mineral resources, I mean, and physically, it's a big country. You know, it's got a big geological endowment. Same with Russia. It's the world's largest country by area. Obviously, they're going to have a lot of minerals, you know. So, like, how do you deal with that kind of dynamic when, and then you figuring that out in terms of, okay, we can have differences on other things, but this is an area where we should be cooperating. And I think both China and Russia would pragmatically agree to that. I mean, during the Cold War, we were, you know, having communication when the situation was much worse. I think we could very much have that, but it requires a certain level of nuanced diplomacy, which unfortunately we have not been very good at because on either side of the, you know, when there's enough blame to go around. It's not just the U.S. We have not been willing to engage on that in a way which is important for bringing scientists to the table. You know, I was hopeful that President Biden, for the first time, we were going to have a scientist in the cabinet with, and then we had that situation with Eric Lander where he was, you know, let go because of accusations of bullying and so on. Now we do have a new a science advisor who's a cabinet member, and she's very capable. I'm hoping that her role, and she used to be head of DARPA and, you know, very accomplished. I think she could play an important role where we get more, you know, science-based decision making around these global issues, and what we call science diplomacy, especially dealing with, and especially Russia and China.
So these would be not a world government, but supranational organizations like the World Trade Organization, the European Coal and Steel, whatever it's called, confederation or conglomerate or whatever, anything like that, that brings countries who otherwise might be in political tension together to solve a common problem. We both want to use these resources. We want to solve this environmental problem. You'll benefit, I'll benefit. So in game theory, it's a, you know, a win-win. You know, it's a non-zero sum game. And in your opinion, since you mentioned Pakistan and India, you know, I'm long interested in nuclear strategy. Why have they not gone to war and used their nukes?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this goes back to the sort of mutually assured destruction kind of Thomas Schelling and others who worked on that during the Cold War, the Rand Corporation approach. I think that is one of the reasons they have clearly not gone to war, but it's been a terribly damaging investment for countries which have abject poverty. And you have generations of people living and dying on street sidewalks, and they're investing in nuclear arsenal. I find that really obscene. But yes, this is the way it is, unfortunately. Where I mean, it goes down to a fundamental question of trust. You know how, and trust is a very illusory concept, and game theory has helped us to try and understand trust. But I think. We need to invest much more in building institutions which can create trust between countries so that you do not end up in these kinds of arms races, which are extremely damaging from the point of view of resource investment and taking away from poverty alleviation efforts. And Pakistan and India are particularly appalling cases because both have such high levels of poverty. And I wish there had been mutual trust created so that they would not have had this escalation, which led to both becoming nuclear powers. But now that now they are, they use it as a vindication when you have situations where other countries also invade because there is. I mean, like Pakistan right now says, well, if we didn't have a nuclear weapon, America would have invaded us, and maybe they're right. So the other problem we have, not only that we have the mutually assured destruction issue, we don't have norms of intervention which are effectively enforced. And so Pakistanis now will argue, they say, look what happened to Libya. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons, and look what happened to him. If Pakistan had given up, we would have ended up the same way. And because we don't have very good norms of intervention, they're probably right. It could have happened. So this is the challenge. We need those institutions which have better norms of engagement, intervention, as well as also a much more sort of sensible investment of resources in developing countries.
And that would probably explain the Kim family developing nuclear weapons in North Korea, who otherwise is probably the poorest country in the world, or at least in the top 5 poorest countries. Because if you have that, you get a chair at the table with the big boys. The United States doesn't invade you. And, same thing with Russia and Ukraine. There's only so much we could do because we know, if Putin loses his mind, decides to push the red button on his desk, even if we have a bigger red button, it doesn't matter. You get that cascading consequences from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And but what I find really perplexing is how much of the quantity of nuclear weapons which were developed during the Cold War, because the mutually assured destruction could have been handled with much fewer weapons. And I find the only explanation I have is the Eisenhower explanation, where really, it was the military-industrial complex which kept on perpetuating it, because just the deterrent aspect could have been handled with far less. So, and that's what the argument I made to recently. Pakistan also. Yeah.
What was the one? The bomb. Fred Barnes, was that his name? Fred Barnes, the journalist that studies nuclear weapons. He has a whole chapter on the arms race in the United States between the armed forces of, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, each wanting its own nuclear weapons. And the way it works in terms of how funds are distributed by Congress around the country, in the same way we have, Houston, we have a problem. Why do we have the headquarters in Houston and the launching pad in Florida? Well, because when, those funds were distributed back in the early 60s, everybody wanted a piece of the pie. So same thing there, where they had to find targets for these nuclear weapons so that they could keep building them and then find more targets because they had so many more weapons. And it was just a runaway arms race within the United States, just so they could keep the budget up. Right. So you have these, I think it was Barnes, again, talking about these, like some airfield in Siberia that's only open 1 month of the year because it's frozen otherwise. And we had like 6 nuclear weapons targeted for this nothing in the middle of nowhere, airstrip. And it's like, well, we got that covered, right? So you end up with 80,000 nuclear weapons or whatever it was in the late 80s. Now it's down to less than 10,000. But for mutual assured destruction, you really only need a couple hundred total, really. But even that is risky in terms of the environmental consequences.
Access and plus this is, it links also to the way in which we invested in the kind of nuclear power technologies. There's good research to suggest that we didn't go into other kinds of technology because the military industrial complex wanted plutonium from the nuclear reactors from power generation. So you see all of the other spillover effects of how that also derailed us in terms of potentially better energy sources.
Right. So, and then one final point on that is, how do you get around the security dilemma, the Hobbesian trap, the other guy problem? I'd give up my nukes, but the other guy might not. Or even if he says he does, he may hold one back just in case I hold one back. So I better hold one back. I better hold 2 back in case he holds 1 back. Right. And you end up with where we are now. I don't know how to get around it. That's a trust problem, right?
It is. That's where you need to develop those institutions. Like, unfortunately, the United Nations, has not reached that level of trust. If it had, because there are structural problems with it. If we could develop that level of trust, I think we could use the UN in that spirit in which it was intended. But unfortunately, we have the Security Council being, very much a vestige of the post-World War II era, with the permanent members having so much power, and then the inability for decision-making to really have teeth. So we're not able to get to that level of trust. But I am hopeful that, within the next 50 to 100 years, we will eventually develop the UN into that kind of system. Now, if you go with the Star Trek mythology, then you would need first contact to get that, right? Because then people would all unite, and you'll get, as soon as the Vulcans landed, all the countries said, okay, we need to have a global government. But I think hopefully we can get, I think even environmental scarcity can lead to the same outcome that first contact might have led to.
Wasn't that Reagan's thought experiment? If we got invaded by aliens, all the countries of the world would come together, of all people.
Yeah. And that's what happens in Star Trek 4. I think is one of the movies that's
right. Star Trek 4.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Star Trek 2 and 4, Rocky 1 and 3. That's how you remember which the good movies were, because the other numbered ones were not so good. Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
a couple other things. The curse of resources here. Say developing countries, say in Africa, that have plenty of resources, but in fact the corruption in the political system is so rampant that it just is a curse to have so many resources, because it leads to this kind of runaway trying to capture it, and there's no central government that regulates that gives mining permits or whatever the term is, and so then you have a problem. So it's really a political problem, not a resource problem. Political and distribution problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I cover this more in my other book, Treasures of the Earth, which focuses on minerals and some aspects of the resource curse. But essentially, I mean, there's structural aspects of minerals which lead to what we call windfall development, a sudden amount of cash coming in, and then the inability to absorb it effectively. And so it leads to kleptocracy and incentives for theft and so on. So what we need for that is some mechanisms of transparency of resource flows. Now, Tony Blair, one of the good things he did was he helped to establish this thing called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is an effort by governments to create a certification system of how, when you have oil or mineral revenues coming in, how do you get transparency so you know that the money is not going into foreign bank accounts and so on. The problem with this system is that it hasn't still been effective in then monitoring whether the money is used for development. It might be transparently put into accounts, but the government still might misuse it. Not for necessarily kleptocracy, but for inefficient investments, So you had, like in the case of Nauru, at one time they had, they were misled by advisors and they invested in, Broadway musicals, which went bust, and they got all this money, they didn't know what to do with it. They invested in a hotel in Fiji, which was, built in a wetland and it collapsed, or, things like that. So you can have those dynamics, and you need like much more stringency in terms of how the investments are managed. But we do have good examples. I mean, you have Norway as an example of a country which it used to be, the sort of the poor partner to Sweden. It was colonized by Sweden. Some would say it was a relatively poorer part of Scandinavia, but now it's got $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, and it's been managing. I mean, essentially, Norwegians are all millionaires because they have enough in that trust fund that if they did nothing, they would have enough resources. But that has happened through effective use of resource wealth management. Even in the US, we have a few good examples. The Navajo Nation, had a lot of mineral wealth, and there was a very visionary Navajo leader at one time who set up a sovereign wealth fund. And the Navajo Trust Fund, is now in the billions, and that has been effective in shielding them in many cases. Now, there's still a lot of poverty because there are other issues, but at least it shielded them from some of the worst aspects of what could have been the resource curse. And so, you can get those kinds of... Alaska has also the Alaska Permanent Fund, which was established partly as a way to deal with the resource curse. Now, they use it in a different way. Alaskans get a check every year in the mail. Like if you're an Alaskan citizen, it's actually very hard to become Alaskan resident because you get this check from the revenues from the fund. So, that kind of sense, I think that can be a solution to some of these challenges of the resource curse.
That's from the oil pipeline?
Yes,
back in the
from
70s?
the oil, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Right.
yep.
Does some of that go to the native populations of Alaska?
It goes to all Alaskan residents. There are some of the native corporations. Alaska is a bit unusual because unlike the rest of the US, they didn't have treaties in the same way with the indigenous people. And even the treaties were very unfair, but at least in the mainland US had the treaties. In Alaska, they didn't have that, so they formed corporations, they're called. There was a separate law passed called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and they established native corporations. Those native corporations can invest in mineral projects. For example, one of the largest mines in Alaska, it's called the Red Dog Mine. It's partially owned by the NANA Corporation, which is a native Alaskan corporation. So then they get additional funds from that. There are efforts to look into those ways of indigenous empowerment.
And can you explain to us how mining rights work? This is something I know nothing about. I mean, somebody finds silver on their land, or it turns out it's government land, and then X corporation says, well, we want to go in there and mine it. And then some other corporation says, no, we want to mine it. How does the government decide who gets to do that and who gets those rights?
So the US is very different than other countries in that way. Most countries, minerals are with what they call the crown. So wherever, even if you have private property and minerals are found under your property, the minerals belong to the state. Now the state may give you compensation or other means to get access, so in Canada, for example, they belong to the state. The US, because of our history as being, entrepreneurial and all this, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think of it, the individual has the rights. And so subsurface rights to minerals are with the individual. And the argument is that here it fosters entrepreneurship. In the US, the other argument is that minerals are a common heritage of the nation, and that they should be with the state for that reason. And so, for example, in the international realm, if you look at the international waters, deep sea mineral resources, there is the Law of the Sea Convention, which governs those. And those are what we call, this is the technical term, is common heritage of mankind. So those mineral resources are then governed. There's an international seabed authority which governs those resources. We have not started mining in the deep sea, but if we ever do, there is an international body which was set up to try and manage it. It's based in Jamaica, and they're formulating regulations on how we would manage that.
And how far out from the coast does the national border go?
There's a continental shelf, essentially, is how it's defined, and depending on where that is, and there are different definitions. There's a Continental Shelf Commission which handles disputes around that, but there are some numbers, but it depends on the continental shelf.
Interesting. So if we found some huge supply of whatever, silver, aluminum, rare earth metals, halfway between here and Hawaii, I'm in California here, who would get to do that? Just whoever gets there first? Or you have to apply to this organization?
If you are a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, you have to go through this organization. Now, U.S. has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. So technically, U.S. could say, we can just go and do it. But that's the other problem with international.
Isn't this an issue up at the North Pole? Whoever kind of gets their shipping lanes going up there and find resources. Russia wants some of that action. We want some of that action. Maybe Canada does. Who owns that?
Yeah, no, I mean right now, because once the Arctic becomes an ocean, it is an ocean, and it's when it unfrozen, it would fall under the Law of the Sea Convention in terms of international waters. But there are claims to the Arctic. The challenge there is that there are a lot of countries which have contested claims, and so there is an organization called the Arctic Council, which is which was established to try and improve governance of the Arctic. It was meant to be eventually leading to some kind of a treaty whereby there could be some shared governance, but we haven't gotten there yet, especially now because of the tensions with US and Russia. Don't know when that would happen. But Antarctica, we do have a treaty. There are a lot of claims on Antarctica too, right? The Norwegians claimed it because they said we were there first. Australia claims it because they're very close by. But there the countries said, look, this place is so important for science. We are just going to put our claims in abeyance, and we're going to cooperate for the basis of science. So Antarctica is actually a great example of science diplomacy at work, where even at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US agreed to the Antarctic Treaty. So
interesting.
That can happen.
That is doable.
Yep.
Isn't there something like that for the moon? Aren't there space treaties?
Yes, there is a lunar treaty also. Yes. My colleague here at the University of Delaware, Julie Klinger, she works on space resources. And yes, the lunar treaty, if they were ever going to mine the moon, that's going to be very relevant in terms of what new protocols develop for that. Yes.
And so some portion of whatever money was gained from mining the moon would go toward humanity?
Yeah.
Everybody gets a check?
I mean, that would be the vision, that there would be some kind of sharing of resources. That hasn't been developed to the level. The treaty is quite ambiguous on those matters right at this point, but they could develop protocols. I think that's where it would potentially, there could be some kind of agreement crafted. And that's certainly within it would follow the law of the sea convention, because in that also the common heritage of mankind principle suggests that it would go to everyone. I mean, some people have argued with the moon is different because it's not like our planet, and that, whoever is willing to invest in it should be able to have that. Others have said, no, it is part of our planet. In fact, it came out of the Theia collision and it became a separate satellite, but it's actually part of
4.2 billion years ago, it was part of Earth, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't there something like that with the Titanic? Because there's these diving companies that go down there and try to get some stuff and then sell it, but it still belongs to the White Line or whoever owned it.
Yeah, there has been contestation around that. Like when you have these shipwrecks, if there is an existing entity that's viable, should they still maintain, especially if it becomes a tourist attraction or some, those are things which definitely then get litigated. So.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Okay, so I've also been reading about the whole subject of reparations for Native Americans for slavery and all that. Arguments are made about the wealth that was generated that the African American community did not benefit from, and whites at the time and generations after did. Okay, but once you start doing those calculations, what about Native Americans? Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, bought Louisiana, which isn't Louisiana. It's, like a third of the United States from Napoleon, but it wasn't Napoleon's to sell in the first place. He never even came here, right? So how would you calculate that? It seems like the amount of mineral value alone extracted from the land, that the Native Americans were here, thousands of years before Europeans. Surely they have some claim on that if you're going to go down that road.
Yeah, those kinds of conversations around indigenous sovereignty and, whether you define sovereignty in terms of who was there first, or whether you define it in terms of who invests first, and whether there is a certain primacy to one versus the other. They are raging on. In the case of Australia, which is one of my countries of citizenship, one of the things, they did not have any, they used this doctrine of terra nullius, which was that the land was essentially, there were no property rights on the land, and so we could do what we wanted. This was not what happened in the US, where there was some recognition that there was prior property rights, but then, clearly there was, the treaties were terribly unfair, and so, I think, this is where also in terms of when we think about earthly order, you have to also think about like where where do we draw the line in terms of temporal injustice and things that happened in the past versus the present, and what is functionally most important for us now moving forward? The argument can be made that for a sense of healing, you need to do away with some of those past claims in order to move forward. And that has been done in the case of, like, in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was the approach that was followed there. These are very difficult questions, and I've worked with indigenous people. Many of them face severe trauma from some of those injustices. Certainly, like we had the issue with the schools in Canada recently, and so I think it's important to recognize those. And figure out ways of compensating them in ways which are realistic. Where it considers the changing norms of the time and what happened accordingly now.
Yeah, I can see something like a government program like the equivalent of the GI Bill after World War II. Okay, you served your country. We're going to give you a free college education in exchange to thank you for this. Something like that. We know we screwed you over. We didn't, but our ancestors did. Okay, and there's generational effects. So, you get an extra tax break on your mortgage if you want to buy a house. You get a tax break for your college tuition, whatever sort of incentives like that. Because you don't want current people who didn't have anything to do with the crimes of the past to feel like, well, why should I have to pay reparations? I didn't do anything, and my ancestors came here just last year, so they had nothing to do with it, or whatever. So there, that would be a tricky one, but I could see how something like that could be done because what's the goal here? What's the goal is to solve these massive inequality problems, right? How come home ownership, income, family wealth is so hugely different? And so that would be, how do we solve it?
And again, if you go back to sort of complex systems analysis approach to it, you see that, in fact, the temporal dimension of wealth and how it spills over, how it gets distributed, what impact that has. It's profound, and you can actually see that. In Delaware, we have the DuPonts, the major family who created Delaware in terms of its economic influence, and now, the old money of the DuPonts, it's now diffused over so many trust funds of the kids and so on. But the impact it has had is remarkable, in terms of that. And so you can see like what happened, what created that, and what events eventually, if you trace back and see what impacts that. The guy who started DuPont, he came because of the French Revolution, and, he had to seek refuge here, and then he started a dynamite company, and then, they diversified, and then they started making everything from nylon to CFCs, So, but that wealth creation, who benefited from it, where, I think it's very fair to do some kind of a complex systems analysis and say, look, this is, these people benefited from that. And whether it is slavery or other things, I think that analysis is worthwhile. So at least, even if we don't do the compensation, I think it gives people a sense of how these kinds of effects go through generations. It's not simple enough to say, well, I had nothing to do with it, because there is that level of linkage. And if we do that, I think it would make people feel better. If actually there is psychological research in terms of reconciliation and peace building, that a lot of people, when they're aggrieved, they don't even want the physical compensation amount as much as the recognition of being wronged. There's very good psychological research on that. And I think if we even come to that, and that's what the South Africans tried to do with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was having that sense of, okay, they were wronged, and coming to that. And that, I think, can help.
Right. Also, some economists like Robert Frank make the point that, DuPont, okay, well, your company was in a country that protected your company from foreign invasion, and we provided roads. and a
Yep.
sound economy and currency that you didn't have to worry about. Like if you were in some other third world country where the currency is not trustworthy at all, we kept inflation in check and all those kinds of things that kind of invisible infrastructure you don't even see still. So somebody has to pay for that, and that's what taxes are about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that kind of, I mean, ultimately, it's about making sure that we are transparent about the ways in which these kinds of underlying processes have what one can say, kind of a chance or luck and randomness, which happens in certain systems, and what is earned. And I think that's the other aspect of this, which is very important, understanding those distinctions.
Right. All right, Saleem, we are right at 2 hours. Let me ask you one last question here. Maybe this will be a future book for you. So let's say Pakistan government, prime minister, whoever it is, comes to you and says, all right, we want to be like whoever, America or Sweden or Denmark or Germany, or we want to be a rich, industrialized. What do we got to do? Just tell me the 10 things I got to do, and I will implement them tomorrow. What do I do?
Yes, so I think my guiding light in that is, generally speaking, I'd say first look at what David Ricardo called comparative advantage. First see what is your comparative advantage compared to others, and what are your resources that give you that edge. Those could be natural resources, they could be human capital, it could have a lot to do with the kind of labor training that you have had. I mean, one of the example of the only country which has gone from being least developed to highly developed within a span of a generation is South Korea. In the 1950s, South Korea's human development indicators were lower than North Korea. North Korea was far more developed than South Korea. But now, what were those core competencies? And one of my former professors at MIT, the late Alice Amsden, she wrote a wonderful book about, why South Korea became an Asian giant. And it was a really complex mixture of having the human capital, which had the kind of skill set to do manufacturing in certain areas, linking that with organizational structures which were very efficient. In South Korea, they have they're called chaebols, industrial houses, which are the Samsungs, Daewoo, LG, all these, and then some foreign direct investment, which was very efficiently targeted, but also when they had security problems. This is one example of a very successful US intervention, which was able to shield it. Just like you have, like when they say in order for life to flourish, you need a good membrane to protect you for the life to develop. The US provided that protective membrane for South Korea to really develop. And so you were able to get that. So I think what I would suggest then is that you follow that's one storyline which has been very effective in being able to follow a development path. And I'd say that if South Korea can do that with a very nasty nuclear neighbor to the north, I think many other countries can do it too.
Yeah, in the moral arc, I have this chart here showing North Korea versus South Korea in 1950.
Oh, yes.
The per capita GDP was $854 for both when they split off. And then you see in the mid 70s, there's this huge takeoff for South Korea, and North Korea is still, down in the trough there. This was 2015, $1,122 per capita in North Korea, $19,600 in South Korea. Basically 20 times the average income. Oh, remarkable. And you can see the difference in from space, right? North Korea and South Korea. Yeah. It's such a dramatic thing. And also North Koreans are like 3 inches taller than South Koreans on average, just better diets.
Because of nutrition.
Right. Yeah. So that's such a great test case.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's and we should be willing to look at multiple pathways of hybridity also. I mean, I think, and South Korea's development was not during all democratic times. Some of it was during military rule as well. And so we have to be also careful. Ultimately, we should aspire for democracy for normative reasons, but we should not also completely disavow certain stages where countries may be in, where they are going through some political turmoil, where they are in this, and we should be careful in not celebrating autocracy, but we should also be willing to work with countries in those dynamics.
Yeah, I like this quote you have in your book from William James. The problem of thinking that the structure over the entire system is one thing, right? If we just have democracy, that's all you need. Well, no, there's more to it than that. Here's what James writes. All the great single-word answers to the world's riddle, such as God, the One, reason, law, spirit, matter, nature, polarity, the dialectic process, the idea, the self, the oversoul, draw the admiration that men have lavished on them from this oracular role. By amateurs in philosophy and professionals alike, the universe is represented as a queer sort of petrified sphinx whose appeal to man consists in a monotonous challenge to his divining powers. The truth! What a perfect idol of the rationalistic mind. Okay, so if there's a theme to your book, it's that it's not one thing. It's a multiple, complex, interactive system that takes a lot of work to figure out what's the right combination.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, Saleem. Thank you for your work. And what you're doing is really important for the future of humanity. So I definitely support that. Thank you for coming on to tell us about it.
Thank you for your book. It's been an honor, really, Michael. I've admired your work for many years. So thank you for this opportunity.
You're super interesting. I love hearing all this international stuff. Very good.